high above the broad, breathing canopy, rain kept time against the watchtower glass. It was neither storm nor drizzle, only a steady, patient music, the little needles of a soft, persistent rain that tapped the curved panes in a regular, polite percussion. Lily woke to that sound as she always did, not with a start, but with the slow, recognizable awareness that the world outside had begun its day, and she, in her small, tall room among the trees, had work that suited such weather. She lay for a moment, palms flat against the thin wool of the blanket, and let the rhythm settle under her skin. The tower had its own inhale and exhale. The wood shifted with the wind. The glass sang when the rain was clever. From the bed, she could see a strip of the canopy, dark and silvered by rain, and beyond it, a suggestion of hills softened by distance. The watchtower was built for looking, and there was something restful in being high enough to watch the world care for itself. Downstairs, the kitchenette exhaled a small welcome. Lily moved through the space the way someone moves through a familiar tune. Kettle onto the stove, a mug taken from the low shelf with a thoughtful hand, sugar kept in a chipped tin, and a spoon that had long since lost its pewter sheen. She lit the small ring of flame and listened to the soft, impatient cough of the kettle as water came to attention. The room smelled of wood smoke and bergamot. The windows, fogging with steam, drew the first tentative beads of rain into pale, temporary maps. She made tea carefully, as a person makes an offering. The tea bag steeped and darkened. She pressed it against the side of the mug with a spoon, letting the liquid cool enough so her fingers could carry the cup without haste. There was a slice of something warm in the tin. A simple butter loaf she had set the night before, wrapped in cloth. She slid a piece onto a small plate, torn at the edge so it looked informal and ready to be shared. Each small motion felt necessary and whole. The glaze of jam, the scrape of butter, the placing of a napkin that her mother had once embroidered with tiny blue anchors. The lamps were lit in a string along the common room shelf, small amber bulbs that made the room believe it was almost afternoon. They threw soft ovals of light across the wooden table, where mugs stood in patient clusters, where scissors and tape might later be found, where a child's drawing, 2 figures and a watchtower with an enormous smiling sun, was held to the wall by a neat dab of beeswax. Lily arranged the lamps with the same measured pleasure she took in aligning pebbles on the sill. Slight adjustments until everything felt right. If you are listening now, there is a particular comfort in such domestic ritual. It is a beginning that recognizes a quiet order in small things, as if setting the kettle to boil were a way of setting the day at right angles to whatever the world might otherwise be. The first visitors came as if the tower itself had rung a bell. Seamus arrived with his cane tapping a patient rhythm on the steps. He moved slower these days, but his arrival was always an arrival nonetheless. His coat smelled faintly of paraffin, and the earth of paths walked. He carried with him a packet of stories. They were the sort that you could open anywhere and find the same small truths inside, like a pocket always ready for keys. Rose came next, her sleeves showing a faint smear of compost. She had been out before dawn tending a neighbor's run of dahlias, and the edges of her palms retained a scent of wet soil and green things. Then the twins, Mara and Joss, who arrived as a single small flurry. Notebooks under their arms, a collection of found feathers and polished stones, cheeks bright with the cold. They drifted into the common room with the ease of habits. A child's arm found a lap. Seamus accepted a slice of warm bread without ceremony. Rose set her bag down and smoothed the dirt from her knees with a small, easy smile. Conversation unfolded in the gentle, overlapping way of people who have been leaving space for one another for years. A quiet exchange about the lengthening of the hedgerow, a murmured question about whether the birch saplings needed covering, a joke about the twins' latest attempt to build a wind toy out of spare ribbon. Sound braided the room. The kettle's polite whistle, the clink of a spoon against porcelain, soft laughter that did not rush. Outside, the rain continued to make its slow music against the glass. The tower seemed to keep time for them. Lily poured tea into the high cup Seamus liked, and watched the steam draw little momentary shapes against the pane. She buttered bread and handed it around as though she had been born to so do. It was how things were done here. The simple, loving round of hospitality that gathered people and kept them coming back. The Watchtower served the community in small, intimate ways. It was not only a place for looking out, but a place for coming together. People carried with them the particular economy of a small settlement. Hands skilled at repair, pockets full of useful small things, an instinct for sharing what had been found. Everyone knew, with the kind of steady certainty that comes from repeated minor emergencies, where to find a length of spare leather or a tin of nails. When Rose set down her bag, a little rectangle of patterned fabric was half visible inside. After tea, the twins would often sit at the table and set to some curious project. Today, they unrolled a strip of translucent film and began to fold it with small, deliberate hands. Their faces were so intent that Lily had to smile. Mara would offer to stitch. Joss would run his hands over the film's slick surface as though to discover what it might do with light. Nearby, Seamus reminisced about a fall he had taken years ago from a low ladder, and how the step had given like an old memory. The way he told it made them all laugh softly, and the moment curled into a comfortable warmth. There is a patience to small communities that is different from the patience of strangers. Here, patience is a practiced thing, like brewing tea. It requires intention, but it yields flavor. People move through their days making the work of living less heavy for one another, and that practice was visible in how the table was cleared, how crumbs were brushed together, and the tin closed with a careful, final tap. Lily kept an eye on the observation hood above the common room as the morning moved forward. The hood was a simple thing, a low, curved canopy of glass and oak that could be unlatched and angled for clearer sight lines when someone wished to lean far out above the trees. It was as much a piece of the room as the stove, though it served a different purpose, to hold and present the sky. She liked to stay near it, to be the one who read the weather by looking not only up, but into the shifting texture of the canopy itself. It was during a lull in the conversation, when the twins were occupied with ribbon and Rose had bent to tend a plant on the sill, that Lily noticed a small, thin line along the edge of the canopy glass. At first she thought it was a streak of rain, or the play of light on the fogged pane. Then she saw the hairline, subtle, like a seam worn by many tiny breaths. A minute of it, and she might have allowed herself not to notice at all, but the way the light caught it made her lean forward with a small human attention. The seam was not wide. It was a slight gap where the join between oak and glass had shifted, a place where a fine bead of rain threaded itself through under certain angles. It let in nothing like a draft, only a faint, persistent bead that traced its route down into the frame. Lily touched the edge with the pad of a finger, feeling for warmth and give. The wood had a familiar give to it, but the hairline remained. It sat at the top of her awareness with the softness of a small pebble in a shoe, irritating, noticeable when she changed direction, but not the kind of thing that called for immediate upheaval. She did not announce it. The room hummed with ordinary conversation. There was bread to be sliced, a question to be answered about whether the twins could borrow the long-handled ladder from the shed. Lily measured the moment as one might measure a piece of cloth. Does the flaw change the whole pattern? Will mending now interrupt the comfort of company? She chose, for that hour, company. Choosing to delay was not negligence. It was a choice made from a certain ethic of care. To leave a small household task until the room had been made full and warm was sometimes to honor the very thing that needed to be held, the quiet that belonged to shared space. She set a cloth over the hairline in the hatch's frame as a temporary, almost symbolic respite, and then she turned to more immediate needs. She cut another slice of bread. She wrapped plates. She told Mara, with a soft, inward smile, to be careful with the glue. But the seam clung to her attention like a small, persistent thought. When she stood with a cup at the window, watching the rain make the canopy shimmer, she found her gaze returning to that thin line. It made a small, oblique promise. Fix me when it suits you. The promise itself was calm. There was no urgency in it, only the kind of invitation that a person who lived with a watchtower learned to accept. Minor things noticed. Minor things mended. Life continued. Noticing the seam also brought with it a series of smaller observations. The leather strap that helped secure the hatch's handle had been well worn at its edge. The brass button that had once held a flap had loosened during the last long autumn. The panes themselves bore tiny marks where insects had once blurred their little stories, and the oak around the frame had a neat, handle-shaped dullness where hands had often rested. Lily catalogued these with the practiced eyes of someone who had been steward of a room for many seasons. The watchtower took its share of weather, and each mark was a memory of attention. None were dire. They were simply evidence that the building listened to the elements in its own patient way. As the day continued, the seam became a small recurring motif in Lily's mind. It appeared and receded in waves of attention. There, during a story Seamus told, absent when Rose offered to prune the dried stems from a pot, apparent again when the twins' handcrafted film caught the light and cast a shy, flickering pattern along the ceiling. The twins, tuned to things that glittered, asked whether the little crack might be mended with one of their translucent panels. Rose suggested a strip of fabric to protect the join from the next sustained rain. Seamus, ever the one with an eye to durable solutions, mentioned a length of leather he had in his bag, an old belt, buffed and lubricated, that he would willingly hand over. There is a certain economy to the community's offerings, nothing extravagant, nothing unnecessary, but a readiness to gift what might cover a small need. It pleased Lily more than she expected. The seam, innocuous and domestic, had already become a small event, not in the way of drama, but in the quiet way communities make ceremony from practical acts. When she finally spoke of it, it was with the softest of introductions. "There's a little seam at the hatch," she said, not drawing sharp attention to it. "Nothing urgent, but it'll need something before the next long rain." Her words were met with a chorus of steady offers. Rose rose with a thought about fabric. Seamus rubbed his chin and suggested leather. The twins' eyes lit at the notion of adding a tiny charm. It was agreed, as such things often are when no one pushes too hard, that they would give the task the right amount of attention. Neither immediate, heaving repair nor idle postponement. By mid-afternoon the tower hummed with the comfortable certainty of joint purpose. Neighbors who had been out on errands, a postman with a wet collar, A woman with spent knitting needles tucked into her satchel drifted by. They paused when they heard of the seam, and each, with a casual, neighborly gravity, produced a small thing from their pockets. A brass washer, a length of waxed thread, a scrap of translucent film cut from a shop window. The items were not remarkable on their own. Together they formed an impromptu toolbox. There was a small, communal joy in doing things with what was at hand. Repair, here, was a domestic hymn. It became a gentle, unplanned assembly. People sat in a loose semicircle around the table, and a bowl of scraps sat between them like a treasure trove. Buttons, a coil of copper wire, a neat strip of leather smelling faintly of oil. The twins laid their translucent film out and asked, with the sort of solemnity children reserve for important tasks, whether it might be cut into small prisms to hang from the hatch's edge. Rose produced a needle she had sharpened with a small stone, and Seamus rubbed a length of leather until it was almost soft with the memory of hands. Lily felt the Watchtower's room shrinking in the best possible way, not by being crowded, but by becoming denser with attention. Mending began as a conversation with hands. There was, first, agreement on approach. Nothing too fussy, nothing that might cause more wear. A covering, bolstered and modest, that would keep the seam neat and allow for the hatch's usual movement. Someone suggested a protective flap of patterned fabric. Someone else, a transparent sleeve that would let the rain be watched without worry. The idea that one consensus was a blend. Leather for resilience, a translucent panel for light, and a little decorative line of prisms to remind everyone that the repair was a thing of communal affection as much as function. The work unfolded in small, methodical stages. Rose measured the gap with a strip of paper and marked it with a pencil made blunt by use. The twins, entrusted with scissors, cut with improbable care. Seamus, with slow, deliberate motions, prepared the leather, trimming the edges and rubbing it smooth. Lily threaded a needle, the action quiet and close to ritual. Her fingers, practiced at small stitches, moved with an economy of motion that felt like prayer. There was a softness to the chatter. Practical advice laced through with stories and jokes. A few recollections of other mending days when another thing had needed a neighbor's hand. At one point, as Lily drew the thread through, Mara looked up and handed her a small folded charm. It was a token the twins had made that morning, scalloped paper, a bead, and a drop of film that caught the faint light. "For luck," Mara said, solemn and proud. "So, the rain will like being watched." The charm was absurdly small and impossibly exactly right. Lily accepted it with both hands and slipped it into the seam that they were preparing to bind. Not at the center, not as a structural part, but as an intimate decoration. It was a minor, ceremonial insertion, and with it the mending assumed the scale of a little festival. Hands moved to a gentle rhythm. Rose smoothing fabric, Seamus holding leather taut, twins offering pins like small flags. The kettle's occasional cough marked the passing of moments. Outside, the rain leaned in like an audience. The canopy above them caught the droplets and let them bead and slide, and every so often a long sound of wood, the tower settling, reminded them of the building's slow conversation with weather. As the work progressed, Lily felt the small pebble in her shoe dissolve into the act of being held. The seam had been a thought at the edge of her attention. Now it had become a center of warmth. Mending was more than fixing a join. It had become a way of answering the question, who keeps watch when the watchers need keeping? The simple domestic choreography of sharing tools, passing scissors, handing over a thimble, was itself a form of care. It stitched them together as surely as needle and thread stitched leather and canvas. There were moments of quiet reflection between tugs and stitches. Seamus, with a tenderness that sometimes surprised those who knew only his gruffness, told a brief fragment of a story about his first Watchtower job decades ago. How a small chip in a lantern once led to a night of shared stories around the stove. Rose hummed a little tune. Words gone, but melody present, and the twins took up a hum that matched her. It was a sound of contentment, not boastful, not triumphal, simply full-bodied and right for the space. At one point, a child from farther down the lane arrived, cheeks flushed and eyes wide with the solemnity of delivering something important. He passed forward a small jar, clean rainwater collected on his way, clear as glass. "For the plants," he said, as though this explained everything, and Lily accepted the jar with a nod of gratitude. Acts like that, a jar of rain, a strip of leather, a charm, are small tokens that accumulate meaning by being offered. They are the architecture of neighborliness, not grand gestures but repeated, modest ones. The afternoon folded into itself. The light altered slowly, skewed by cloud density and the deepening of the forest's shadow. The prisms the twins had cut were threaded at last, and when Lily held them up they took the light and divided it. Small, trembling rainbows slid across the table and onto the palms of the hands that had made them. A hush of delight, a few soft exclamations. Someone found a feather they had forgotten in their pocket and placed it beside the charm. Yet the seam was not yet finished. There remained the step that required a steady hand and a few careful final tugs. The leather needed to be fixed into place and the translucent sleeve secured so it would not crowd the hatch. They had the materials, the will, and the gathering of enough hands to make the action safe and sure. But it required Lily's decision to lean forward and take a particular part of the task. It required her to stand beneath the hatch and hold the pieces true while another guided the needle. And in that small expectation of responsibility, she felt a familiar, pleasant tightening. The weight of being entrusted with something exact. She paused briefly in the heat of the task. The pause was not indecision, but attention. She looked up at the Watchtower's canopy, watching the rain make little silver trails and countenances of light. There was a kind of answer in that observation. Everything in the tower moved, the rain, the wood, the conversations, and there was a space to choose how to meet the motion. She breathed in the smell of wet oak and tea and leather. Her fingers had the faint oiliness of work. Her palms smelled of bergamot and wool. Before she committed herself to the final stitch, Seamus cleared his throat and smiled in that way that meant he had a thought softened into a gift. He dug into his bag and produced, with a disarming flourish that made everyone laugh, a small brass washer which he offered to line where the leather might meet the brass of the handle. "Just a little something to stop a rub," he said. Rose produced a dab of waxed thread to add to the strength. The twins insisted on the charm's placement being visible from the outside so that anyone looking up at the tower would see it and know someone had tended it. Lily accepted these offerings with a modest, grateful hand. She threaded the waxed thread through the needle and felt its coarse tension. The room grew otherwise quiet in the particular, respectful silence that happens when a group concentrates on a single small motion together. The hum of the lamps, the distant rain, the twins' careful breathing, these were the sounds that framed the action. Just as she prepared to make the first of the holding stitches, a soft knock came at the door. It was the sort of knock that posited a presence rather than demanded. Gentle, measured. For a moment everyone looked up as if the world had turned its face in through the doorway. The knock carried with it the possibility of interruption, but also of continuity. Neighborliness in motion. Lily rose with the thread in her hand and walked to the door, leaving the leather and the thread and the small brass washer waiting on the table like a promise. At the threshold stood a woman Lily had seen around but did not know well, a new face in a familiar rhythm. She wore a wet cloak, the hood pushed back, and her hair was frayed at the ends with rain. She held in her hand a compact packet, wrapped in waxed paper, and upon seeing Lily, her face eased into something like relief. "Sorry to trouble you," she said softly, her voice the kind that had been softened by many small seasons of speaking kindly. "I thought I'd bring this by. I heard the tower was, well, I live down by the old mill lane. I thought you might like it." She extended the packet with a shy care. Lily took it, and, in the brief exchange of looking, glimpsed a little token of shared concern. The packet contained small squares of translucent material and a neat ribbon, the sort of thing that could be made into a prism or used as a protective layer. It fit the mood of the room as though it had been meant to. "No trouble at all," Lily said, taking the parcel. The woman smiled, and, as she turned to go, said, "Glad I could help. We like to know who's watching over the trees." Her voice slid back into the rain. The small interruption widened the circle briefly. The arrival of unexpected help felt like the icing on a communal intention. Objects exchanged hands with new reverence. The leather, the film, the tiny brass washer, the charm. Lily felt the care present in the room swell, not in any loud way, but with the steady volume of mutual agreement. "This is what we do." She returned to the table and to the waiting leather. The moment to begin the final stage had come around like a clock. She sat, placed the leather over the hairline, held it flat with one palm, and bent the needle with the other. She threaded the small brass washer into its place and drew the first stitch through the leather and the oak, feeling the thread's resistance like conversation. The thread held, taut and willing. The twins watched, eyes wide, as if witnessing the passing of something invisible and important. As the needle came back up and Lily prepared for the second stitch, she felt, with a familiar but sharp clarity, the particular satisfaction that comes from shared, patient work. It was not the satisfaction of having saved anything colossal. It was the deeper contentment of having seen and been seen, of having contributed a small, necessary thing to the continuity of a shared life. Yet even in that contentment there remained, like the aftertaste of tea, the sense of a story still unfolding. The seam had been engaged. The repair had begun. There were stitches yet to be set, decisions yet to be made about how the prisms would hang, and how the flap would close around the weather. The clock of the day moved, and with it the night would come, bringing another turning of tasks and songs. Outside, the rain did not hurry. It pressed against the canopy in the same measured hand. Inside, the watchtower felt both busy and exquisitely slow, full of small gestures and the kind of attention that unspooled into evening. Lily drew the next stitch through and felt the thread catch like a breath held and released. The room leaned in, quietly, as if to lend its attention to the final tucks. At that moment, when the needle hovered, and the hum of joined effort filled the air, a shadow shifted in the doorway. Not a person, but the long, familiar hour moving toward dusk. The light outside grew thinner. The rain's silver tone deepened, and the watchtower settled in on itself like a hand closing around something warm. The repairs so far had the look of half-finished music. Notes moved into place, but the final cadence had yet to sound. The group felt the small electricity that comes before a task is complete, a pull toward the end that was not yet authorized to arrive. Lily paused, needle poised, and for an instant the room existed as a whole between two breathless beats, the one that held the work so far, and the one that would carry them into the careful finishing. She looked, briefly, at each face around her table. Seamus, with his sure, slow hands. Rose, whose palms still held the scent of planting. The twins, earnest and delighted. The stranger who had brought the wrapped film. Neighbors with pockets of small tools. The watchtower's glass sighed as a fresh bead of rain unlatched itself and threaded a soft, shining path down the pane. She made the choice to let one last small ritual settle in before she finished. She set the needle aside and reached for the sand glass on the shelf, turning it with a practiced flick. The grains began their slow fall, and for the length of one measured pouring, everyone in the room allowed themselves a pause that was as useful as any stitch. The kettle, having cooled, released a last gentle pip. The lamps softened. The room breathed with the sand. When the first grains had dropped, when the twins had begun a low, mutual hum, Lily picked the needle up again. The moment felt aligned. She drew the thread through the last time for now, and the leather held as if pleased to be held. The translucent film was not yet wholly fixed. The prisms were waiting to be tied. The charm promised a place of honor but still needed anchoring. The readiness of things hovered like a held note in a song. Outside, the canopy kept watch. Inside, those gathered prepared, each in their small way, to finish what they had started. It was the kind of ending that was not a conclusion so much as a hinge, a place where one action led to another, where the comfort of the day folded into the purpose of the night. Lily felt, in the readiness of her hand and the gathered stillness around her, the adequacy of small things tended by many small hands. The final stitch for the moment was not yet pulled. The watchtower waited, full of the soft, patient electricity of a task about to be completed. The rain continued, faithful to its own percussion, and the room leaned toward the next movement as though listening for the sound of a latch settling or a charm catching the last winter light. Lily felt the thread settle like an answer as it drew through the leather and oak. The first of the final holding stitches made the seam look less like a wound and more like the careful join it truly was. A line of attention, neat and patient. For a moment she simply held her hand there, feeling the slight give of the leather against the steadiness of the frame, hearing the hush that fell when a group concentrates on the same small work. "Careful now," Seamus murmured, and his voice was the kind of weathered permission that always made people slow their hands. Rose moved to his side to steady the leather, while the twins held up a length of thread, watching the way it caught in the lamplight. Beyond them, the newcomer in the wet cloak smiled from where she had warmed herself by the stove and set down the packet she had brought. There was a small choreography to the last acts of repair. One person steadied, another offered the right tension. A child made a careful, decisive knot. Lily threaded the next gap and drew the stitch tight. The brass washer Seamus had given them sat between leather and handle, discreet and splendid in its small usefulness. When at last the last stitch was drawn through, Lily tied a knot and, with the plain satisfaction that comes from closing an undone thing, she tucked the end under the leather where it could not fray. A soft laugh rippled through the room. quiet, private, the sort that acknowledges a neat job. The twins both made a small, theatrical bow, as though they themselves had been the ones to choose the exact angle of the knot. Rose clapped her hands together once, as if applauding the seam itself. The newcomer nodded at Lily in that particular concise way strangers have when they feel briefly included in a known pattern of living. "There," Lily said, and the word was like closing a book. It had the same gentle certainty. There remained the translucent panel, which would sit against the glass so that one could still see the rain, but the join would not suck in little beads of water. The twins took to tying the prisms with a solemn enthusiasm. They had looped tiny lengths of ribbon through each prism, strips of film folded into neat triangles that scattered the lamp's amber into cool watercolors. Mara threaded a narrow cord while Joss held the panel in place and adjusted its angle by eye. "Think," said Mara, looking very seriously. "If someone were looking up now from below, they'd see the charms grazing the sky. It'll be like a necklace for the tower." Seamus chuckled. "A tower with good taste," he said. "Don't let it get above itself." They fixed the translucent sheet into place with the waxed thread Rose had provided, anchoring the top with neat stitching and then letting the curtain of prisms fall in a shallow, protective fringe. The little charm that Mara had made was tied at the central knot, visible from within, and, crucially for the twins, visible from the lane below. They insisted on this with the proud seriousness of those who have labored on a gift and want it to be seen. When the final fastening was set, Lily reached up and, with Seamus's steadying hand on her shoulder, unlatched the hatch and eased it forward. The canopy shifted with the bespoke obedience of something that has been used gently over a long time. Rain blurred the outside into a wash of green and gray. The forest looked as if someone had taken an enormous soft brush and feathered every leaf. A small silver trail ran along the edge of the glass where the seam had once been, and now followed a slightly different path, diverted by a newly smoothed face. Lily ran her palm along the leather lip and felt the stitch beneath it, warm with the imprint of many hands. She looked up at the prisms, the charm blinking like a small eye, and, as though inviting the world to notice, a drop of rain fell farther than the others and caught the edge of a prism. The drop refracted, tiny and precise, and for a breath of a second it held a whole little arc of color. Someone near the table caught that light in their palm, and there was a small, delighted murmur. "It likes being watched," Mara said, as if stating an indisputable quality of the rain. There was a sense, in that moment, of the room having completed something that was at once practical and ceremonial. The mending had done what mending does. It had stitched an object and a people together. The Watchtower's canopy, with its now trimmed seam and a fringe of small prisms, looked as if it had been given an old friend's careful mending, the sort that makes it more telling than when it was merely new. They did not hold a formal ceremony. The ritual here was domestic and small. Lily cut another slice of the butter loaf and handed it round. Someone fetched a tray and another kettle was set to simmer. Rose broke open a jar of chutney she'd made the previous summer, and the taste of sharp fruit and butter seemed, to everyone, a perfectly deserving reward. They sat around the table with their spoons and plates, the prisms overhead catching lamplight and sending trickles of color across faces and knuckles. Seamus, whose voice had the soft roughness of a pebble, filled the lull with a story. Not long, not important in any measurable way, but precisely the sort of small memory that knits presence into place. He spoke of a watchtower where, one winter many years ago, a window had cracked, and the community had spent a night mending it, while a child had fallen asleep on a pile of rugs and woken to find the repaired pane full of stars. The memory was nothing like the incident at hand, but the telling served its purpose. It placed their action within a pattern, a tradition of looking after small things, and by doing so looking after the people who relied on them. As guests tucked in and the lamps hummed, a quiet tune threaded itself through the conversation. Rose hummed a line that had the soft cadences of something learned from a mother. The twins picked up a counter-melody with their lips pursed and their eyes intent. The tune was wordless but full-bodied, an oral cloth that settled comfortably over the table. For a while they all hum-sang into the rhythm of the work now complete, and it felt like the sort of music a room makes when it is content. Outside, the rain kept its steady, patient percussion. From her seat, Lily could feel the slow breath of the forest against the glass, the restlessness of branches hushed by weather. Inside, they talked of small things, the rout of a hedgerow, whether the postman had been seen that morning, the possible colors for next week's bunting. The conversation had the shape of a river garden, meandering, clear, and threaded with small currents that mattered only to those who tended them. As twilight deepened into a kind of blue that made the lamps seem like safe suns, the newcomers and neighbors began to drift away, taking with them their pockets of shared warmth. The stranger from the mill lane stayed long enough to be offered a pot of tea in return for her packet. She accepted with a shy gratitude and, on leaving, promised to return a ribbon or two she thought might suit the prisms. Seamus took his cane and moved toward the door with the deliberation of someone who knows the weight of goodbyes. He paused, hand on the latch, and said, "You keep them well, Lily." And the words, simple, were heavy with the kind of trust that flourishes in small settlements. After the last of the feet had scuffed away and the door had shut, the Watchtower room settled into a different kind of quiet. The lamps were left on low, the table cleared, crumbs brushed into the tin and closed. Lily moved through the small acts of tidying with a practiced precision. She hung the twins' scissors on their peg, washed the mugs and set them to drain, folded the cloth that had wrapped the butter loaf and put it on the shelf. Each action was a small seal on the day. There was a ritual Lily's always observed before turning to her own rest. She lit a little oil lamp by the watch chair and set a low cup of chamomile on the small side table. The lamp threw a pool of mellow light where she could sit and look up through the canopy. It was in that chair, under the halo of lamp and the scatter of prisms, that she would let the day untie itself. Before she sat down, she walked to the hatch and, with Seamus's earlier steadiness in mind, ran her hand over the leather flap. She felt the knots beneath the surface and the smoothness where hands had worried and smoothed. She arranged the prisms so that they hung evenly and set the charm to face outward. The placement pleased her. It pleased the twins when she told them later that she had pinned the charm just so. Small approvals like that are the currency of such places. She set the sand glass back onto its shelf and turned it once more, watching as the grains threaded down in patient measure. For the length of its pour she sat and let the room be its usual body, lamps breathing light, rain making its slow, constant punctuation against the glass, the forest a broad chest rising and falling. The ritual of watching the sand was a personal clock, a way to resist the hurry of the world beyond the tree line, and to remind herself of the steadiness of small things. When the last grain had fallen, Lily rose and drew a small blanket over the chair. She left a saucer of crumbs on the step outside the door for any passer-by who might fancy a nibble, and a small pot of tea in a thermos she had tucked beneath the table for the postman. These were acts that had no urgency but felt, in the long run, like stewardship, leaving a small kindness in case someone needed it on the road. She then climbed the narrow familiar stair to her bedroom. Her movement upward brought her once more close to the canopy. Through the slit of the window she could see the prisms, tiny and bright, catching the last of the light and throwing slants of color into the dark. The watchtower from above was a small world. A cup, a chair, a bed, and a roof with a newly tended seam. Lily placed the twins' charm on her bedside shelf. Near, but not in the way, a gentle company to cross the night, and smoothed the blanket with practiced hands. Before she lay down, she stood for a moment at the small window of her room and watched the rain. From this height, the drops looked like silver threads. The canopy beneath them sighed and shifted with a slow, shimmered motion. The prisms spread a delicate lattice of color on the undersurface of the trees, and she imagined, for a second, the lane below looking up and seeing the watchtower like a small, blinking lighthouse among the leaves. There was neither triumph nor grand finale in the way she felt, only a steady contentment that came from the knowledge that a day's tending had been done with the best of available hands. She thought, for a while, of small things. Seamus's brass washer, Rose's neat stitches, the twins' earnest pride. She thought of the stranger's parcel, the child's jar of rainwater, the way the kettle had coughed and settled into silence. The day had been a chorus of modest notes. As she climbed into bed, Lily set the lamp low and let the room make itself small and comforting. She placed the charm where she could see it, and the prism's scattered light touched the corner of the pillow like a benediction. She folded her hands across her chest, breathing in the smell of bergamot and wool, and let the sound of rain take the last wide space. If you are listening now, perhaps you can let the tapping of rain be something like a steady hand on your own shoulder, a reminder that small attentions add up. The watchtower kept its slow watch. The forest kept its slow weather. In time, Lily's breathing matched the creak and sigh of the wood and the steady percussion of the drops. The house hum of the room and the little contented ache of work completed spun their quiet spell. There is a particular peace that arrives not from the end of danger, but from the completion of care. The canopy above the trees held its new seam with a modest pride. The prisms hung like voicemail lights in a treetop lobby, catching and scattering what fell upon them. The tower itself felt, in a way too small to name, more deliberately held than before. Not because it had been fixed to perfection, but because the act of fixing had been shared. Lily's last thought, as sleep settled like a gentle cloak, was as simple as the morning's first ritual, that being high above the trees afforded a certain quiet perspective. From there, the rain became music rather than problem. From there, small things could be seen and tended and turned into something worthy of being noticed. She slept with the comfort that the place where she kept watch was itself kept by many small, steady hands. When dawn would come again, there would be tea to make and bread to slice and, inevitably, new little things that would need mending. But for the moment the watchtower breathed in its slowness, and the rain tapped the glass in a patient, unhurried meter. The room held the light in a small domestic halo, and the forest kept its secret rhymes. If this morning has held you in its calm, and you would like to come back to similar stories of small people, slow work, and the soft music of weather and habit, you can follow this series for more. For now, let the rain above the trees keep time with your breathing. Let the small rituals be enough. The watch continues, gentle and steady, and you are welcome to rest with it.